So good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're going to have a Q&A session at the end of each presentation, so save any questions till then. And I'm going first, so allow myself to introduce myself. So, as I said, good morning. My name is Richard Boylan. I am a film and TV major in the College of Communications, and today I'll be presenting to you my Keystone presentation, a documentary titled North to Alaska, following a trip that my dad and I took last summer from Rhode Island to Alaska. So even though I'm a film and TV major, working on a documentary was something completely new for me because up to this point I was solely interested in narrative filmmaking. And while they have similarities such as needing a strong script, a good central conflict, and characters you can relate to, when it comes to production, they wildly vary. So, for instance, in a narrative film during pre-production, you'd be working on the script, casting actors, scouting locations. But for me, since everything I was going to film unfold in real time, I really just kind of had to hone in into the story I wanted to tell, and from that make a perspective shot list and perspective outlines so that when it came to actually filming, I knew what shots I needed to get to tell the story I wanted to. So in figuring out my story, I had to answer the question, why Alaska? And to do so, let me take you back to 1987, when my dad, at the age of 22, the same age that I am now, decided to go cross-country with two of his best friends from New York to Alaska. And since then, growing up, I lived for stories of traveling to Alaska. Anything that I couldn't picture in my mind from his stories, I could supplement with the hundreds of photos he brought back from his trip. And hearing his stories so many times, the Alaska trip kind of became shorthand for this cross-country odyssey that he took. They became legend, pretty much, part of my family's story. So, considering I've never worked in documentary before, you might be wondering, why did I decide to use that as the best form to tell this story? And there's a number of reasons. First, it's much cheaper than shooting a narrative film. You need a much smaller crew, which in our case was just 2 people. It takes much less takes, and you can film it pretty much anywhere and everywhere, which in our case, sometimes we really were anywhere and everywhere. In addition to that, the form of the documentary really served the reality of what I was trying to capture. I wanted to capture the history, the emotion, just the day-to-day life of our time on the road, and doing it through a documentary was the best way to preserve it as close to it actually happened. Plus, between movies like National Lampoon's Vacation, The Muppet Movie, and Easy Rider, I'm a big fan of the road trip genre, and in my research, I realized that there's really no good road trip documentaries, so this is kind of my contribution to the genre. And then, whereas my dad preserved his trip through oral stories and photos, I want to take it to the next level and, with film, really capture events as they happen and preserve them, and write the next chapter of my family story. Which brings me into production. So every single day on our trip, I'd ask myself the question, what is film worthy? I knew from the start that other than some input from my advisor and some friends and family, I'd be the only one editing this film, so I really had to curb any impulse to film everything. Of course, just the realities of our trip too kind of limited what I was able to film. So half the time, since there was only 2 of us, half the time I was driving, and during that point, filming wasn't being done. So there was some great moments I missed out on that I had to either try and recreate later on or hopefully evoke through our interviews. In addition to, since we were traveling on a course that would only bring us to each place once, I really had to focus in, hone in on getting B-roll and just like capture our lived experience. So it wasn't actually until we returned back from the trip that I started doing interviews with my dad and I, and it was only a few days before I hopped on a plane to head to London for a semester abroad when I finished the first round of interviews. So I was 3,000 miles away when I really started to edit and realized that I was going to have to record a lot more interviews and a lot more B-roll to tell the story I actually wanted to. Now, in a narrative film, you typically already have a script attached, so you have your story from the start. But for a documentary, post-production, the editing phase is the most important part, because that's really where you take all the footage that you have and realize a story that you actually can tell. Or, in my case, find the story again and again and again. The first shot, right away, I knew I want to tell my story in a chronological way. Our Alaska was really was the midpoint of our trip, since in reality we had to travel back too, and I wanted the film to reflect that. And I also wanted to put in every single stop that we made. And it became quickly apparent to me that the film would be much too long, and it was going to get very boring telling it, and then this happened, and then this happened sort of narrative. So a month in, I scrapped everything and restarted. And I decided to take a less chronological approach and really just forefront my dad and I's shared experience. And while it made for a better cut, I kind of lost my voice in the process of making it. So for my third cut, I went back to pre-production and really just tried to remind myself and figure out what kind of story it was that I wanted to tell. And it was something that I realized it had to be something really rooted in our relationship and why taking this trip meant so much to me. So I made a new cut that interwove my point of view, my dad's point of view, and sparingly used our shared point of view, taking the trip together, to make something that was much more compelling and concise. Now, whereas my dad's photo album usually just sits on a shelf in our basement, I knew that from the start I wanted my film to be for more than just the two of us. So in doing so, I created a 3-tier distribution plan. The first is a premiere screening that I'm holding next weekend for friends and family back home at a local theater, which means I will be going against Doctor Strange 2 at the box office. And then in addition to that, over the course of the next year, I want to start submitting my film to documentary film festivals and film festivals that focus on first-time filmmakers. And then, of course, after talking about it this long, I'd be remiss if I didn't show you guys a clip.
Attention. A tsunami warning has been issued for this area. Move to high ground immediately. Tune to your local radio station for details.
What are they, like 100-foot waves or something, aren't they that big? One big roller?
It depends a lot on the landscape.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I know in your original project.
Oh, I guess he has microphones too.
Should I go grab it?
Yeah.
Thank you. So I know, is it on? Can you hear me?
You can just go ahead.
Okay.
Oh, wow, yeah.
So I know in your original project presentation, like 2 years ago, you had wanted to go with your friends instead of your dad. So I'm curious, like, what the decision-making process was in changing that, and how it like affected not only the documentary but also like your experience on the trip itself.
Yeah. So originally, I had 3 friends that were going to come with me, and then they all dropped out one by one until 2 weeks to go. My last friend was like, "I don't have any money. I'm sorry, I can't come." So. So I was kind of like left scrambling, figuring out like who can I invite to come. And like a week out, my dad's like, "Well, I guess that's it. I guess I'm going to come with you then." So he kind of took it upon himself to make the decision. But honestly, I think it made the story so much better because it was really able to foreground our relationship. So I was stressed out for a long time, figuring out how I was going to still go on the trip. But in the end, it all worked out, and I think it was just kind of meant to be.
Awesome. Thank you.
So, since we can't see the full thing now, I was wondering if you were willing to share maybe your favorite moment from the documentary itself.
Yeah. Wow, that's a good question. I've watched it through so many times that maybe I don't know. I just like it all equally at this point because I'm so used to it. No, I think there's a point at the end when we actually when we're at Homer, Alaska, and it's just kind of like a reflection on being there, and the landscape is so beautiful there. It's just kind of like a montage of like the mountains and the ocean there, and it's kind of like subdued, but I really like that part. I think that's my favorite.
Hi. Hello? Oh. How long did it take you to get to Alaska, and what did you do when you got there?
Yeah, so we spent 3 weeks traveling cross country to get there, and then once we got to Seattle, we flew to Alaska since Canada was closed at that point. And when we got there, we landed in Anchorage, Alaska. We spent 3 days there, pretty much just walking around, seeing the town, and then took a bus down to Homer and spent another 3 days there. And Homer, Alaska is all the way at the bottom tip of Alaska. It's out in this like peninsula, so it's water on 3 sides, and they have this small little just kind of like fishing town there, and it just, I don't know, it's like such a quaint little place. There's not like a lot going on, but it's just like got that like small coastal town feel. So we just kind of, I don't know, just lived there and kind of checked out for a few days.
Thank you.
Thanks. I can't wait to see this film. And I hope you'll come back and do a favorite film screening at Kilachand maybe next year.
Oh, yeah, happily.
But I have a more theoretical question.
Okay.
So the way you framed this was a move in your own filmmaking trajectory from narrative to documentary. But I'm intrigued that you also contrasted the mythologizing of your father's trip through pictures and the documentary aspect of filming this. And I wonder how you think about all of those sorts of genres together, narrative, documentary, myth, and how they blend into each other, and what you think is the process of your own documentary version of this in terms of a future mythologizing of it.
I think at the simplest, what I really had to wrap my mind about, like it took me the longest, was when it came to editing, was the fact that like I was so set in the documentary having to like stick to the truth exactly, everything follow how it happened, and it took me a long time to get through that and kind of realize that like I can use footage that like maybe it didn't exactly take place where like I say it does, or I said it did, like the scene is taking place, but as long as it conveys the same idea. So like I have some where like we're on the road, say like driving through Colorado, and maybe like the footage I took from us on the road is from like another state, but it has us talking about being Colorado. It kind of like conveys the point of like how long we traveled. So I think it took me a while to realize like how much mythologizing you can do like in a documentary film too, where as long as you keep the core of it truthful, you can kind of use the footage and play with the pieces of it. All right.